What was your scariest something's not right moment? Back in middle school, I was walking to school one morning when a car pulled up beside me. A woman leaned out and called me Linda. It wasn't my name, but it was close enough that I looked up. She quickly apologized, explaining that she thought I was her granddaughter. Then she offered me a ride to school. The thing was, I was already standing on school grounds, just a half block away from the entrance. When I politely declined, she became insistent, almost demanding that I get in the car. I said, "No thanks," and without a second thought, I started running. It only hit me much later that she probably never intended to actually drop me off at school. I was working on a radio system at the local water tower in a remote outback town. It was a gorgeous late spring day in October when I arrived, but after a couple of hours, everything started to change. The usual bird sounds vanished, the breeze stopped, it just got eerily quiet. I had a strange feeling like something wasn't right, so I took my equipment out of standby and flagged it as a live test. I didn't feel like I had time to finish testing properly, so I decided to step outside and sit in the car for a moment. About 90 seconds later, the tower I'd just left was struck directly by lightning. It was the tallest structure for 200 kilometers, and when it hit, it was the loudest sound I've ever heard in my life. Absolutely deafening. I was planning to visit my dad in the afternoon, so I called him in the morning to ask if he needed anything. I was heading to the store anyway, and I could easily pick up a few things for him. But he didn't answer. It was a little odd for him, but not entirely unusual. Still, something nagged at me in the back of my mind. I tried again about 30 minutes later, still nothing. No answer on either the landline or his mobile. At that point, I decided to go over there early and check on him. I can't really explain why, but I just had this feeling that something was wrong. When I got to his house, I found him. He had fallen and cracked his head open. To this day, I don't know what was worse, finding him like that, or that 30-minute drive where that nagging feeling just kept growing, knowing I was going to walk into something awful. I was living about 5 hours away from my parents and decided to spend Easter with them. The plan was to take Monday off work and drive back that day, but for some reason, I decided to head back on Sunday night instead. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a strange noise and reached over to tap the touch lamp next to my bed. It made a loud popping sound and then turned off. Something didn't feel right, so I got up and grabbed the bedroom door handle. It was so hot that I instantly pulled my hand back. It turned out that my entire apartment was on fire. The living room had caught fire from a faulty electrical outlet, and by the time I woke up, it had spread to the dining room. The only ways out were either through the living room to the front door or through the dining room and kitchen to the back door. With everything in flames, I mustered whatever strength I had left, shoved my headboard away from the window, and broke the glass. I screamed for help, and thankfully my landlord had been letting someone illegally live in a storage room. He heard me and ran straight down the block to the fire station. The firefighters were able to get me through the window and then put out the fire. I was hours away from my family, had no money, ID, phone, or the car keys. The fire had taken all, and it was barely 4 a.m. I lost almost everything that night. My neighbor was kind enough to let me shower at her place and give me some clothes until my parents could drive down. It wasn't me who first sensed that something was off. One day, a woman came up to me on the train I was on and said, "I just wanted you to know that that man over there is following you." And sure enough, he was. He followed me quietly when I switched trains, and it got to the point where I felt uncomfortable enough to ask a police officer to walk me home. It was one of the creepiest experiences of my life. Looking back, I realized I probably shouldn't have gone home that night. I'm pretty sure he stopped following me once I talked to the officer, but still, the whole thing left me shaken. I've had two experiences with my upstairs apartment that I'll never forget. The first happened when I came home from work. As soon as I stepped out of my car, something felt off. My upstairs neighbor's dog was outside, which wasn't unusual, but she was acting strangely. Normally, she'd be excited to greet me, but this time, she just sat by his door, adding to my unease. About 20 minutes passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling. I decided to check on my neighbor and see if he wanted to grab a drink. As I approached his door, I noticed his dog had gone inside, but was now barking nonstop. I knocked, then knocked harder until I was pounding on the door. I tried the handle, but it was locked. I ran down and through my own apartment to a back stairwell that connected our residences. I opened the door to his apartment and found him overdosing on Percocet, convulsing on the ground, struggling to breathe. The paramedics said that if they had been called just 10 minutes later, he might not have survived. That wasn't the first time something disturbing had happened in that apartment. About 2 years prior, when I first moved into the building, an elderly gentleman lived there. He was a homebody, didn't have internet or even a smartphone, and enjoyed the simple pleasures of scotch and his blues records. Roughly 3 weeks after I moved in, I stopped seeing him. I didn't think much of it initially, as I didn't know him well and wasn't familiar with his routine. Weeks went by, and I noticed he hadn't been playing his records, and it was unusually quiet, but I didn't think much of this because I wasn't well acquainted with the guy, so I didn't really know his schedule/habits. Around the third or fourth week, a foul stench began to permeate my home. I lit candles and sprayed Febreze, but nothing helped. One day, I came home, and the smell was unbearable. Then it hit me. It was the unmistakable smell of a dead body. I called my landlord, who arrived quickly. As soon as he was confronted with the smell, he went pale. We rushed to the elderly man's front door, which he unlocked, given the extreme circumstances. Inside, we found my former neighbor dead, decomposing on the floor. He had been there for so long that his blood had soaked into the floor and was seeping into my bathroom ceiling. You could see it inside the light fixtures. I was driving past a small park near my home when I saw two older couples on the sidewalk, peering into the park. The women looked deeply distressed, and the men seemed to be trying to console them. I slowed down and for a moment considered stopping to see if I could help, but I hesitated and drove on. The next day, I learned that a young person from the neighborhood had taken their own life in that park. I can only assume that those two couples were the ones who made that tragic discovery. My dad had just passed after a long battle with cancer, and towards the end, my mom's behavior had started to change. She wasn't taking care of him like she used to, and I ended up leaving work to step in. She didn't seem to be mourning his loss, even though they'd had a decent relationship. A couple of days after he passed, I was going through his things when I realized it was already 10 a.m. and my mom hadn't gotten out of bed. I thought maybe she just needed some rest, so I left her alone. But as the hours passed, 11, 12, 1, 2, 3, I started to feel uneasy. She had never stayed in bed this late before. So I opened her door to check on her. What I found shook me. She was on all fours, her chest resting on a stool, surrounded by a large puddle of urine and feces. I still don't know how she ended up on the floor. I feel like I should have heard her fall. After cleaning her up, I asked her what had happened, and she told me she hadn't had the strength to get up or the presence of mind to call for help. I ended up taking her to the ER that day, and that's when I realized I wouldn't be returning to work anytime soon. From that point on, my life changed, and I knew I'd be caring for my now terminally ill mother for the years to come. I was home alone one evening when someone rang the doorbell. It was dark outside, and I could make out a figure, but his face was obscured, just a shadow. I didn't open the door since he didn't say anything, so I went back to what I was doing. However, my dog kept staring at the door, acting like he sensed something was wrong. A couple of hours later, my parents came home and mentioned there were 2 police cars on our street. It turned out that the person at my door was a burglar. He had knocked out one of my neighbors and stolen from their house. This happened 2 years ago, but I still feel uneasy. I can't shake the feeling that I might be the only one who saw his face clearly. When I was 10, my grandma was watching my younger siblings and me while our parents were away at a weekend-long work conference. We were in the living room, eating pancakes. My siblings were glued to cartoons, while I was lost in the latest Harry Potter book, which had just been released the day before. At one point, my brother asked my grandma for more pancakes, and she started to get up. I wasn't really paying full attention, too focused on my book, but out of the corner of my eye, I noticed she was taking longer than usual. She tried to stand, but her leg wouldn't move. She struggled, trying to lift it with her hands, but one of her hands wouldn't move either. That's when I realized something was seriously wrong, so I put down my book. Then, she suddenly fell out of her chair and collapsed onto the floor. I screamed. She tried to reassure me, saying she was fine, that her leg had just fallen asleep and she tripped. But her voice was slurred, and only half of her face was moving. I remembered seeing similar symptoms in a Babysitter's Club book, and I immediately recognized that it looked like a stroke. Panicked, I ran into the kitchen. She didn't have a cell phone back then, and called 911. Well, first I called my best friend, the only number I could remember, and asked her mom if I needed to dial an area code before 911. After I got that figured out, I finally dialed 911. Meanwhile, my siblings had gone outside to get the handyman, who was mowing the lawn, to come inside and help. The ambulance arrived and took her to the hospital. After that, my memory of the events gets a little fuzzy. Somehow, my best friend's mom must have gotten in touch with my parents because they showed up at the hospital later. But here's the good part. Because she received treatment so quickly, my grandma made a full recovery. Nearly 20 years later, she's still in great health and alive today. I've got 2 stories that still shake me up. The first one happened when I was working as a bouncer in the middle of nowhere, Missouri. One night around midnight, I got sent to Walmart to grab a few things. As I was driving down Highway 50, I caught a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision, a figure on the side of the road, barely noticeable, but enough to make me stop. I pulled over, and a young woman came up to my passenger door, looking absolutely freaked out, nearly hyperventilating. She was so shaken I couldn't understand what she was saying, so I just told her to get in my truck. As we sat there, trying to calm down, she started to speak, but just then, a van pulled up behind me, still on the side of the highway. A man jumped out and rushed toward my open window. Without thinking, he grabbed the girl and started yelling at me, cussing me out. I didn't hesitate for a second, though. I took a deep breath, and in the calmest, deepest voice I could muster, I told him to back off and that she wasn't leaving my truck. I had no idea what was going on, but I made it clear that I was taking her wherever she wanted to go. As we drove to the hospital, she told me her story. She was from out of state. She'd met some guys through a friend, and they assaulted her and dragged her out to a field. They beat her until she played dead, and she escaped when they stopped for gas. I don't normally stop for strangers at midnight, but something deep down told me to slam on my brakes for that woman. The second story happened while I was still bouncing. At the time, I used to drive girls to private shows. One of them decided to schedule her own show and try to pocket all the money without tipping me. She was supposed to meet a group of guys at a closed gas station off Highway 50, but they wouldn't give her the address, just told her to show up there. On the way, she got nervous and called me. I was half asleep, but agreed to meet her. I tried talking her out of it, telling her to just turn around, but she insisted. She said if I didn't go with her, it'd be my fault when she went missing and ended up on the news. I met her at the empty gas station, and the whole scene made my gut twist. It was sketchy. They weren't expecting me, and I knew assholes get stupid when they feel spooked. We sat there for a while, me trying to convince her to go home. Then, 3 vehicles rolled up, packed with drunk guys. She got out of the car, trying to be friendly, but the second I stepped out and they saw me, they started hollering, cussing, and sped off in a hurry. I'm not a tough guy, but they definitely didn't expect a witness. I've never felt more thankful to be there that night. So yeah, my advice, avoid Highway 50. An hour after my sister had her baby, I video called her. She picked up the phone and just said, "I don't feel good," but something in her voice was so off, so chilling, that I couldn't shake the feeling something was wrong. An hour later, she was hemorrhaging and all her vitals were plummeting. It turned out she had a major complication that the doctors had missed. It was the scariest time of my life. She spent 3 weeks in the ICU, but thankfully, she made a full recovery and the baby was perfectly healthy. Now, 2 years later, that same baby is climbing all over me as we enjoy Christmas together. But I can still picture the exact look in my sister's eyes when she said, "I don't feel good." It still gives me chills. During the UK's first lockdown, I hadn't seen my dad, who lived on his own, for 3 months. But we spoke on the phone every day without fail. One night, around 2 a.m., as I was drifting off to sleep, I suddenly felt this overwhelming wave of anxiety. My heart started racing, I was sweating, and something just felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling, and it kept me wide awake with worry. I decided to call my dad, knowing he'd be up since he's always a night owl, but to my surprise, he didn't answer. By now, my anxiety had tripled, so I woke up my partner and told him something was wrong. My dad hadn't picked up the phone. He suggested we give it until the morning, and if he still hadn't answered, we'd drive over to check on him. But I couldn't ignore the feeling, so at 3 a.m., my partner and I decided to drive the 3 hours to my dad's house. When we got there, I walked inside to find my dad sitting in front of the wall, his skin looking grayish yellow, slurring his words, and completely confused about where he was. I immediately called an ambulance, and my dad ended up spending the next 4 weeks in the hospital. He had acute kidney failure caused by undiagnosed end-stage liver cirrhosis. The doctor later told me that if I had arrived just a few hours later, I would have been calling an undertaker, not an ambulance. It turns out the confusion from the cirrhosis had made him believe the TV remote was his phone, which is why he hadn't sought any treatment. Kidney failure can progress so quickly, and with the two conditions together, it's fatal within hours. If I hadn't shown up when I did, he wouldn't have gotten the treatment in time. Now, as I'm typing this, my dad is driving over to spend Christmas with us, and his cirrhosis symptoms are well controlled. It's a happy ending. Sometimes, I guess, anxiety can be a life-saving gift. Edit, I'm honestly overwhelmed by your support and kindness. Thank you so much. For some extra context, I lost my mom and stepdad just 6 months before this happened, so my dad is really my rock. I'm incredibly grateful for every single day he's healthy and happy. Even though his cirrhosis isn't going away, at least we still have time on our side. When I was about 19, I was standing outside the mall near the employee entrance, waiting for my boyfriend to get off work. It was around 10 p.m., and the mall had already closed, so the parking lot was pretty empty. A car pulled up to the curb, about 15 feet away from where I was standing by the wall. The driver, who was alone, rolled down his window and asked if I knew how to get to a certain road. That road was visible from where I was standing, so I pointed and told him the exit to it was right across the way. He kept staring at me, though, and said, "I'm having trouble hearing you." So I took a few steps closer and raised my voice to repeat myself. He then asked, "Could you show me? I'm terrible with directions." That's when my gut instinct kicked in. Something about the way he was acting didn't sit right. It felt like he wanted me to get close enough for him to grab me or to get into his car. Without hesitation, I pointed to the road and said, "Drive that way, you can't miss it," then quickly walked back into the employee entrance to wait for my boyfriend. I wasn't supposed to be inside, but honestly, getting yelled at by security seemed way better than the alternative. I'm just glad I trusted my instincts. This happened about 10 years ago when my grandmother was still alive but in her last stages. My dad and I visited her frequently at the nursing home as she couldn't live independently and was in her late 90s. One day, I was wandering around the nursing home while it was undergoing renovations. I don't know why, but for some reason, I lingered in the main corridor instead of heading straight to the lounge to wait for my grandma. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang. I rushed down the hallway toward the public bathrooms and found a lady in her 80s lying on her back, covered in blood. It turns out she had been coming out of one of the toilet stalls, turned around to close the door, tripped on her shoes, and fell backward, slamming her head against a bench near the door. Blood was everywhere. Thankfully, I had spent 5 years as a first aid officer, so I knew what to do. I managed to get her sitting upright against the wall, took out my clean handkerchiefs, and started trying to stop the bleeding. There was a lot of blood. But, of course, because the nursing home was under renovation, absolutely nothing was working. The panic buttons? Broken. The nurse call buttons? Not working. The nurse station at the entrance was empty, as expected. And here I was, stuck trying to help this woman who was bleeding heavily with no idea where to find help. I couldn't leave her alone to go search because she could pass out at any moment, and besides, there weren't any signs anywhere to point me in the right direction. I was there, waiting, trying to calm her down and stop the bleeding, when finally, an elderly man walked in to use the bathroom. He saw the scene and asked, "Do you need me to find the nurses?" I could barely keep it together and shouted, "Yes, now!" He rushed off, and after what felt like an eternity, the nurses finally showed up about 10 minutes later. By the time they arrived, I'd been with the woman for about 15 minutes, and in total, it had been at least 30 minutes before help came. If I hadn't been there to visit my grandmother, if I hadn't decided to linger in the corridor, that lady might have bled out before anyone even found her. The only reason the nurses came at all was because that man had gone to look for them. The nurses took over and treated the woman's head wound. The next time I visited my grandma, I walked into the nursing home and saw huge signs plastered on the walls. Nurses stationed this way. Funny how that happened. This didn't happen to me, but to my brother when he was about 7 or 8. He was walking home one day when a man pulled up beside him, insisting that he needed to take my brother to the hospital because he was limping. The man started trying to push my brother into his car, but my brother had recently had foot surgery, so something didn't seem right. Thankfully, our neighbor, whose kids we used to play with, was nearby and noticed something was off. She yelled at the man and quickly took my brother inside her house, making sure he was safe. The police were called, but they couldn't catch the guy. Years later, we found out that the man, along with his car, matched the description of the person who later kidnapped Stephen Stainer, a highly publicized case in our area. It's crazy to think about how different things could have turned out if our neighbor hadn't been paying attention and stepped in when she did. I also wanted to mention that Timothy White, who became a sheriff, passed away from an aneurysm. I like to think he did a lot of good during his time. I was about 16 or 17, driving back to my place from 7 to 11 in my mom's car with a friend. It was around 2 a.m., so the streets were completely deserted. We pulled up to a stoplight, and out of nowhere, a motorcycle with a passenger pulled up way too close to the passenger side of my car. I had a bad feeling, but I didn't act on it and just continued chatting with my friend while we waited for the light to turn green. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the passenger pull something from his backpack. It looked like a rod or a hammer, and start winding up like he was about to swing. That's when I knew I had to get out of there, so I hit the gas and sped off as fast as I could. I managed to lose them pretty quickly and made it home safe. My friend had no idea what was going on until we pulled into my driveway, and I was still shaking a bit. When I was just a kid, my grandfather decided to take my cousin and me on a trip to the gas station to pick up diesel for the tractor. We lived on a farm in the middle of nowhere, so there wasn't much else to do. We all piled into his old single cab S10. 3 of us squeezed into that tiny truck. Me in the middle seat, my cousin on the passenger side. We were around 12 or 13, with long hair for boys in our town. When we pulled up to the gas station, my grandfather parked at a pump and headed inside, leaving the keys in the truck with us buckled inside. In a small town like ours, where nothing much ever happened, this was nothing out of the ordinary. We thought everything was fine, that is, until something fell off. Just before my grandfather walked inside, an elderly man, about the same age as my grandfather, sitting on a bench outside the station, stopped him. They exchanged a few words, but I couldn't hear them, and I suddenly had this weird, uneasy feeling. My grandfather went inside after a brief interaction with the man, who didn't take his eyes off us as he sat there. Then, without warning, the old man stood up and started walking right toward us. My cousin and I began to panic. We were locked in the truck, but as the man reached the driver's side door, he swung it open. My cousin unbuckled and told me to get out, but the panic had already set in. I tried to unbuckle my seatbelt, but it was stuck and I couldn't get it loose. My cousin tried to help, but the buckle wouldn't budge, and he jumped out, yelling for me to hurry. The old man grinned at me, his eyes cold, as he reached for the keys in the ignition. I still remember his evil smile, and I thought, this is it. I'm done. Then, just as I felt like my world was collapsing, I saw my cousin lean back in through the door holding a hammer he'd grabbed from the truck bed, screaming that he was about to hit the guy. The old man immediately froze, hands up, and said, "I was just joking," before climbing out of the truck. He walked behind the station, disappearing as my grandfather came out, none the wiser. When my grandfather got back in the truck, my cousin and I tried to explain what had just happened, but it didn't make much sense. I think we were still in shock, and he was so old, so trusting, that he couldn't grasp the danger we had been in. Once we got home, we told the rest of the family. They immediately turned to my grandfather, asking what the man had said to him. He told them that the man had just asked if we were his granddaughters, but didn't pay much attention to him because the man seemed deaf. Turns out, the creepy old man thought we were two little girls and was planning on abducting us. If my cousin hadn't acted so quickly, I'm not sure I'd be here today to tell this story. That moment scarred me deeply. I remember feeling utterly terrified, crying the whole way home as my cousin comforted me. That man's smile still haunts me. It was pure evil. Even now, I still dream about it from time to time. As soon as my grandfather realized what had happened, he called all the men in the family, grabbed their guns, and they immediately drove back to the gas station. They called the police and searched the area for about an hour before the authorities showed up. The man was never caught. I hope he's rotting somewhere out of sight. I probably shouldn't feel that way, but part of me still wishes my cousin had taken that hammer and beaten him senseless. Maybe then I'd have been able to sleep a little easier over the past 10 years since it happened. I was about 13, walking home from school along the railroad tracks when an unmarked Crown Vic pulled up on the adjoining road. The driver, dressed in a suit and tie, waved me down and started yelling for me to come over. Being a naive kid, I thought it was a cop, so I started to head toward him. Just as I was about to get closer, another real cop pulled up behind him. He got out of his car and approached the guy in the suit. They talked for a second, and then the real cop turned to me and told me to go home. Looking back, I realized how close I was to being caught in a potentially dangerous situation. I was almost a victim of something much worse. It was a dark January night when I was driving a semi hauling two 20-foot trailers south on US 93 in Arizona. This stretch of road is infamous, known as Head-On Highway. At the time, it was under construction, being transformed from a two-lane road into a four-lane divided highway, with a 55 miles per hour speed limit. As I drove, I noticed headlights coming down a hill, followed by a sharp right-hand curve at the bottom. In an instant, I realized something wasn't right with the lead vehicle. It was crossing into my lane. Before I could fully process it, the vehicle was on my shoulder, heading north. My immediate reaction was to steer left and try to avoid them. But there was a double yellow line separating the two lanes, and as I got closer to it, I heard my father's voice in my head, clear as day. You do not drive in their lane. Do not drive in their lane. My father had been a union freight hauler with 2.5 million accident-free miles when he retired. He'd passed away 11 years before, but his words were as strong as if he were right there. I eased off the throttle, letting my left foot gently feather the brakes as I hugged the yellow line on my side of the highway. The other driver, realizing he was heading straight for a row of crash barrels near a guardrail, swerved back into his lane. At that moment, I was down to about 35 miles per hour, and he was still traveling around 65, according to the accident investigation. He hit us on the driver's side steer tire, knocking it off the axle and tearing the fuel filter off the engine. We rolled a short distance before the hood popped open and I saw flames licking up from the engine. I yelled at my co-driver, who had slept through the entire accident, that we were on fire and needed to get out. He scrambled out of the sleeper, cowboy hat in hand, and I grabbed the fire extinguisher, spraying it under the cab. I could see the fuel line had been displaced, and diesel was pouring onto the spreading fire. I tossed the extinguisher aside and quickly grabbed my coat, our logbooks, and the bill of lading, which was crucial because we were hauling a load of flammable materials. Meanwhile, the other vehicle had come to a stop about 100 feet past us. The Arizona Department of Public Safety, DPS, arrived soon after, and it was discovered that the driver had been drinking. They found a case of beer bottles in the back seat, half of them empty, and shut the scene down as a crime scene for drunk driving. It took fire and rescue an hour to cut the roof off the vehicle and extract the driver, who had a broken leg. His brother, sitting in the jump seat, had a broken arm. Our tractor and front trailer were burned to the ground. I'll never forget the sound of the tires exploding due to the fire. When a tire hits 110 psi, it makes a hell of a racket. A couple of months later, I received a letter of commendation from DPS. The accident investigator told me that the two brothers probably owed their lives to the way I handled the situation. It all happened in a flash, but even after 16 years, I still get emotional when I think about it. I had just parked my car at work and was walking around in my trunk when I noticed a jogger in the parking lot who I didn't recognize. Normally, we see people jogging or walking from the other businesses in the office park, so it wasn't unusual. But something about this guy made me feel uneasy, like I shouldn't turn my back on him. He wasn't acting suspicious or anything, but I still couldn't shake the feeling. I was trying to dig my lunch out of the trunk, but it had rolled all the way to the back, and my arms weren't long enough to reach it from where I was standing. I knew I'd have to lean deep into the trunk to get it. As I leaned in, I kept my eye on the jogger, and I saw him stop jogging and start sneaking along the row of cars, heading straight for mine. In hindsight, I should have slammed the trunk shut and run for the front door. Instead, I squared up, faced where he was coming from, and yelled, "Good morning. Can I help you?" just as he slinked around an SUV next to my car. He was caught off guard, turned, and walked away. A second later, one of the managers came charging out the front door, yelling at me to get inside because there was a predator in the parking lot. We never saw that guy again, but after that, I made sure everyone was on the lookout for him. I often wonder what would have happened if I'd been distracted, like checking my phone or something. Would the manager have gotten there in time? It's something I still think about, even though it's been about 6 years now. Our work parking lot is very safe, and I've never even heard of anyone having things stolen from their unlocked cars. But after that, it took a long time for me to feel truly safe there again. One day, I was in a parking garage across the street from a courthouse after filing a document. I'm a paralegal. I got off the elevator where I thought my car was parked, but when I looked around, it was nowhere to be found. This wasn't totally unusual, so I started wandering, pushing the button for it to beep. After about a minute, I noticed a guy walking around too. He didn't seem to be following me, but something about him still gave me the creeps, so I kept an eye on him. There was no one else on the level except for him and me. After a few more minutes, I figured my car must be on a different level, so I got back on the elevator to head down. I got off on the next level and waited for a second, but the guy wasn't in sight, so I chalked it up to my paranoia. I began wandering around again, pushing the button for my car. Then, as I turned a corner, there he was again. At that point, I knew he was following me. I made a beeline for the elevators, but then I saw him heading toward them too. It seemed like he was trying to cut me off, and I started to panic. Once again, we were alone on the level. Just then, the elevator doors opened and two guys in suits stepped out. Without thinking, I rushed up to them and said, "There you guys are. I've been looking for you all over this level and the one above. Where the hell did you park?" I laughed to cover my nerves. The guys exchanged a quick glance, but didn't react. One of them replied, "Oh, sorry about that. We're on this level, but we took Tom's car instead of mine, and I forgot to tell you. We're parked over here," and they led me away. I saw the guy who had been following me stop, stare, then start down the stairs next to the elevator. As soon as he was out of sight, I told the two guys what had happened. They helped me find my car. It turned out to be on the first level. I just hadn't gotten close enough to hear it beep, and I was finally safe. To this day, I'm sure the guy had been waiting for me to find my car, so he could do something bad. Now, I avoid parking garages whenever I can. If I'm forced to park in one, I take a picture of where I park so I don't get lost again. I also carry pepper spray on my keychain. I once took a class that covered various aspects of theater production, including lighting. One day, I was using a single-person lift to get 20 meters above the stage to make a minor adjustment to a light. As I was raising the lift closer to the light, I suddenly had a strange feeling, and then that feeling grew stronger. I looked up at the light, and it was like a red flag went up in my mind. Every single safety measure on this heavy light, hanging 20 meters above a busy intersection of walkways, was either faulty or completely wrong. It was that bad. In that moment, I realized how close this thing was to falling, and it could have easily killed someone. To make matters worse, the person who had worked on it before had managed to mess it up in a way I never thought possible. This person, who had somehow managed to get certified to operate a two-person lift, had also managed to touch the power coupling of this dangerously hot light, making it stay in place in a melted state. The power coupling was barely hanging on, still functional somehow, and it's a miracle the entire auditorium hadn't gone up in flames the moment this mistake happened. This was especially terrifying for me because I had been involved in extracurriculars in that auditorium for 9 years, and every time I passed under that light, I unknowingly put my life at risk. The light had probably been untouched for nearly a decade, meaning every single time I walked that path, I had been in danger. I immediately went to work fixing the light, making sure everything was properly secured and safe. I also had every other light in the auditorium thoroughly inspected to make sure nothing else was hanging by a thread like this one had been. As it turned out, all the other lights were in perfectly safe condition, and I'm just grateful this situation didn't end in disaster. The summer before graduating high school, I was home alone while my family went camping and I had to work. It was one of those rare occasions where I had the house to myself, so I decided to mow the lawn since it was one of my chores, and it really needed to be done. Not long after I started, I felt a sharp pain on my ankle. I looked down and realized I'd been stung by a wasp or possibly a yellow jacket. I'd been stung before and never had any serious issues, so I didn't think too much of it first. However, I didn't want to mow over the nest, so I moved to the front of the house and called my dad, jokingly telling him to deal with it when he got home. As soon as I hung up the phone, I felt an itch on my palm, which quickly escalated. I started feeling an intense light sensitivity, and within moments, my eyes were practically squeezed shut. A wave of dread hit me, and I realized something was seriously wrong. I tried to make my way to my neighbor's house, but halfway there, I collapsed. I could still breathe fine, but it felt like I had absolutely no energy. I managed to crawl to their front door and ring the bell, but just before blacking out, I apparently said, "There might be bees outside." The next thing I remember is waking up the paramedics trying to get me to come around. They asked if I could walk, so I tried to stand, but as soon as I took a step, I blacked out again. I later learned that what happened was a combination of anaphylactic shock and dehydration. I had no idea that was what was going on at the time. I always assumed that people who had bad reactions to stings would get swollen throats or itchy spots, but none of that happened to me. My blood pressure had dropped so low that I looked like a ghost, according to my neighbors, and I was apparently losing blood from my extremities. The paramedics told me that if I had been just 5 minutes longer in getting help, I wouldn't have made it. It was a wake-up call for me, and I've never underestimated a sting since. A few years ago, I went to a friend's house for a party. She had invited another friend, who we'll call Grace. Grace brought this man with her, and everyone at the party was practically fawning over him. Apparently, he was a somewhat well-known local artist. But the moment I laid eyes on him, I got this seriously unnerved feeling. I couldn't explain why at the time, but something about him just felt wrong. His eyes were the worst part, totally void of emotion, just cold. It was deeply unsettling. I pulled my friend aside and told her that this guy was freaking me out, but I couldn't explain exactly why. She brushed it off, saying I was being overly sensitive and that he was a local gem. So I tried to shake it off and join the conversation. After all, it was a small party and I didn't want to make it awkward. Not 5 minutes later, this guy asks me, my friend, and Grace to go on a road trip with him to a remote waterfall in Montana. He was insistent, saying it's a spiritual experience. I go there all the time, I bring people up there. Naturally, I declined. He spent several minutes trying to convince me, but none of us were interested. My friend was busy with work, and Grace had something important to do, so eventually, he dropped the subject. Fast forward a few months, and Grace kept seeing him. Out of nowhere, this guy completely flipped and started abusing her. She broke up with him, but he didn't take it well. He started driving in circles around her apartment, calling her nonstop and leaving terrifying messages about how he was going to kill her. She had to call the police, and they detained him. To stay safe, she moved to another city overnight to escape him. I've never been more sorry to be right. Thankfully, Grace is safe and happy now, but the whole thing still shakes me. It's one of those moments where you wish you could trust your gut more than anyone else's opinion. I used to hang out with this guy, a regular at the cafe where I worked. One day, he asked if I wanted grab drinks, and that's how our drinking friendship began. At the time, I was a heavy drinker. My roommate and I would often take 5 shots just to get tipsy and then keep drinking through the night. One evening, he invited me out with some friends to this pub. I got my own drink first, and then he offered to buy me a second one. By this point, I trusted him, so I didn't go to the bar when he did. He came back with a drink, and I drank it. It didn't take long before I felt something was off. Within minutes, my head started spinning, I was slurring my words, and I felt incredibly drunk, way more than I should have. I knew something was wrong immediately. I needed to leave. He tried to convince me to stay, but I pushed past him, determined to get out of there. He followed me outside. This was back when Uber was just starting, so I called one to get a ride home. While I was trying to close the door, he kept arguing, suggesting that maybe he should come with me to make sure I got home okay. I didn't care. I left without him. The next day, I slept all day. I couldn't move, and I was in and out of consciousness. It felt so strange. And then it hit me. Why did I think it was him who drugged me? The night before, I had tucked all my cards and my ID into a zippered inside pocket of my jacket, making sure they were secure. But when I woke up, they were gone. All of it. And guess who had them? That guy. I realized he must have gone into my jacket, taken everything, probably hoping I wouldn't be able to pay for a cab. The joke was on him, though. Uber had just launched, and I still managed to get home. A few years ago, I was at the local mall with a friend. She went into the bathroom, and I was waiting outside by myself. It was close to closing time, so it wasn't surprising when a guy approached me and told me it was almost time to leave. But the moment I looked at him, my stomach dropped. Something felt off. I realized immediately he wasn't a security guard, but he acted like one. He even offered to escort me out of the building. As people walked by, I noticed his badge was just a cheap plastic thing for some toy store. That's when I knew for sure he wasn't legit. I told him no and kept waiting for my friend. The more I looked at him, the more uncomfortable I felt. Every time I glanced his way, I got chills. When my friend finally came out of the bathroom, he was gone. She asked who I'd been talking to, and after I told her, we left quickly. A week later, I was back at the mall, getting some things, and I decided to ask an actual security guard about the guy. To my surprise, the guard said they had to escort him out multiple times for posing as a security guard and trying to get teenagers to come with him to his car. I haven't seen that guy since, but every time I pass that bathroom now, I get this unease. Waiting there felt like hours. I often wonder what would have happened if I'd listened to him, or if anyone else did. I hope not. Edit. The cops here are useless, and I'm not sure if they ever caught him. At the time, they couldn't do anything. Honestly, they don't even bother with handcuffs half the time. I just hope no one else was hurt by him. I was home from college visiting my parents for the weekend. My sister had taken over my old bedroom, so I was sleeping in the guest room right next to it. I was on my way out of the house and had no reason to go into her room, but something made me stop and peek in there at the last minute. While I looked inside, I saw that her old portable space heater had been left on and had tipped over, resting on top of a cardboard box. I was the last one to leave that day, and if I hadn't checked in, the whole house, along with all of our pets, could have burned down. Another close call happened while I was back at school. I had planned to crash at my boyfriend's apartment one night, but for some reason, I couldn't shake this strange feeling that I needed to go home. Even though it was late and cold outside, I decided to head back to my place. When I got inside, all my roommates were already asleep, but something caught my eye, the stove light, indicating that the burners were still on. I went into the kitchen to check it out, and to my horror, I realized my roommate had left one of the burners on low, with a kitchen towel resting on top of it. That towel could have easily caught fire. It was another close call that could have turned into something much worse if I hadn't listened to that nagging feeling. About 2 years ago, around midnight, I took my dog outside for her nightly walk. As we stepped out, something just felt off. I live in an area that's not as secluded as it once was. New housing developments and expanding towns had slowly eaten into the open spaces and woods, leaving animals like deer with fewer places to roam. Some animals have been displaced, and now, things like deer in yards and a screech owl nearby had become more common. My dog has this habit of walking all the way to the edge of our yard, about 30 feet from the front door, to find a good spot. We were about halfway there when I noticed something strange. It was completely silent. No crickets, no owls, no coyotes howling in the distance. Nothing. It felt like the world had gone still. That's when my heart rate started to spike. There was something watching us. Ever get that feeling? Like you can sense danger deep in your bones. A primal instinct that warns you of something predatory? It was like that. Something in my brain was screaming at me to get out of there, but the feeling wasn't just mine. I looked at my dog, and she was acting strange too. Her eyes were locked onto something, and her hackles were raised. I didn't even know a golden retriever could look that disturbed and threatened. When I finally managed to get her moving, I didn't waste any time. We ran for the door, and I don't even remember making the decision to run, just that I did. It felt like I closed that distance faster than I ever had before. For months after that, whenever we went out at night, My dog wouldn't go more than a few feet past the sidewalk. We put a fence up in the backyard, but she still wouldn't go outside alone. Even now, she's clearly uneasy at night. I know what it's like to be around coyotes. They don't make me feel threatened, and I've never felt that kind of danger when they were nearby. But this, whatever it was, felt different. It felt bigger, more dangerous, and like it had a predatory intent. I never saw what it was, but I can tell you that it was something I don't ever want to encounter again. Whatever it was, I'm thankful I never had to find out what it truly was. It was a bright, sunny afternoon, and I was walking home from the subway, taking the quicker alleyway to my apartment. I had just returned from a weekend trip, so I was lugging a rolling suitcase behind me, feeling a little off balance, but nothing too unusual. Up ahead, I spotted a guy who looked a bit sketchy, but I brushed it off. After all, it was a busy, sunlit afternoon, and I didn't want to assume the worst. He glanced back at me, and I gave him my best. I'm a city girl. I'm tough. I know how to handle myself, nod, walking with purpose. It might have worked if I didn't look like I was 15 instead of 25. As I continued walking, I noticed he started to slow down and the distance between us started to close. So, naturally, I slowed down too. We ended up moving at what felt like a painfully slow pace. He trying to close the gap, me trying to keep it steady. Eventually, he stopped near a car and began fumbling around for his keys, and I felt myself relax a bit. Oh, okay, just a guy looking for his car in the city. No big deal. I picked up my pace to hurry past him and get that last block to my apartment. But of course, the moment I made a move, he turned and started following me. Spoiler alert, it wasn't his car. That's when the oh shit moment hit me, followed quickly by a wave of self-doubt. How did I fall for that? Honestly, I could never miss an opportunity to berate myself, so I thought, damn it, you should have known better. I quickly scanned the street, and miraculously, there were no cars close enough to be in immediate danger. So, in what was probably one of the fastest decisions I've made in my life, I bolted into the street and ran across it, rolling suitcase and all. Yes, I dragged that damn suitcase along at full sprint because I had to hold on to that change of clothes and toiletries, right? He tried to chase me for a few strides, but gave up after realizing it wasn't worth it. I still ran all the way home. Honestly, it was a minor miracle I managed to do it, given my usual sedentary lifestyle. But that's the story of how I almost got robbed, assaulted, or worse, just because I made the mistake of walking 5 blocks home with a suitcase at 3 in the afternoon and ignored that little voice in my head telling me to trust my gut. I started off with just a bellyache. It didn't seem like a big deal at first, so I brushed it off. But by the 3rd day, I woke up feeling extremely dizzy, to the point where I almost collapsed. That's when I decided to go to the hospital, even though I'm not one to run to the ER for every little thing. I'm not a fan of doctors. Turns out, I was about a day or 2 away from dying from sepsis due to a ruptured and infected diverticulosis. I didn't even know I had diverticulitis. If I hadn't gone to the hospital, I would have never known, and I probably wouldn't have made it. The only reason I was able to get checked out and treated in time was because of the Affordable Care Act. Without it, I'd be dead, and my kids would have ended up in foster care. So yeah, thanks Obama. A few years ago, I was coming home from work and noticed a guy leaning against the wall near the entrance of my apartment building. Right away, something fell off. People don't normally just stand there completely motionless like that. My gut was screaming that something was wrong. And I caught myself thinking, that guy is black. You can't just avoid him because you're being paranoid. Don't be a racist. So, trying to prove something to myself, I decided I had to walk past him and enter the building to show that I wasn't making judgments based on his appearance. As I walked past him, I heard him move as soon as I got past him. I instantly had this feeling that I needed to look back, and as I did, he stabbed me in the back with a concealed knife. It all happened so quickly, but turning around might have saved my life. The knife hit at an angle rather than straight on. I managed to scramble up the few steps to the entrance, hoping I'd have some high ground in case he came after me again. But instead, he panicked and ran off. I called the cops, who tracked him down a few blocks away, still holding the knife. Long story short, he was arrested and ended up serving 14 months in prison. The stab wound was pretty superficial, but I didn't want to go to the hospital at first. The cops practically forced me to go because, as it turns out, if I went, they could charge him with a more serious crime. So I went, and I'm actually grateful they made me. During the hospital visit, they did an MRI, which ended up catching something in my throat, a growth on my thyroid. It turns out I had the very early stages of thyroid cancer. A year later, I had to have the right side of my thyroid removed, and they found cancerous cells, but thankfully it hadn't spread yet. So, as of now, I'm in the clear. Here's the kicker. I had the worst health insurance imaginable, so I ended up paying out of pocket for most of the hospital costs. However, the guy who stabbed me was ordered to cover my medical bills, and to my surprise, he's actually sent me about $700 so far. I honestly didn't expect to get a dime from him, so that's something. I've finally paid off the hospital bill, but I'm still dealing with separate bills for the ambulance and radiology. Out of 4 bills, I've managed to pay 2. It's been a hassle, but in the end, everything worked out better than I could have expected. I'm alive, I caught a health issue early, and I didn't let my initial fear define me. It was a rough experience, but it could have been much worse. I had been happily married to my husband for almost a year when one day, his phone rang. The name on the screen was Jessica. I was a little surprised because I didn't recognize the name, and I'd never heard of any friends he had by that name. So I innocently asked about it. His reaction was immediate and extreme. He became incredibly defensive, followed me into the bathroom, and blocked my way out. Then, with a wild look in his eyes, he told me that if I ever mentioned the name Jessica again, he would choke me out and make my daughter watch me die. I was absolutely shocked. I couldn't believe how quickly things escalated, and I was terrified at how he went from the man I had known for years to someone who seemed completely out of control. Obviously, I survived. I managed to talk my way out of that situation, but just a few weeks later, he assaulted me. I ran to my family for safety. He pled guilty to assault and was sentenced to only a few weeks at Fort Leavenworth. I got a restraining order against him, and we've had no contact since. This all happened in 2013. It's been a long road, but I'm in a much better place now, and I've moved on with my life. Happy ending for me. I accepted a ride home from a male friend, someone I'd known forever. We lived in a small town where everyone knew everyone, and my boyfriend had left the party early. My friend offered to take me home, and I thought nothing of it. At the time, everything felt normal. A few hours later, I was very drunk. He started driving me home while I played with the radio and chatted away, barely aware of time passing. As the minutes ticked by during the 35-minute drive, it suddenly struck me that he hadn't said anything for a while. That's when something changed within me. A feeling of intense alertness washed over me, and I snapped out of my drunken haze. I'm not sure if it was adrenaline or some kind of instinct kicking in, but suddenly I was sharp and fully aware. I realized we were no longer on our usual route home. We were on a rural road, much farther out than we should have been, and I looked over at his face. He wasn't there. He was in some other place, somewhere far away, and I felt pure terror. It was a strange sensation, this gut instinct telling me I was in danger. I had known him my entire life. I should have felt safe with him, but something was wrong. In that moment, I started talking. I called her by name, asked about our mutual friends, made small talk, tried to keep the conversation light and normal. All I wanted was for him to snap out of whatever dark place his mind had gone to. And somehow it worked. He started paying attention again, and whatever sinister plan he had been considering faded away. Years later, I think about that night and wonder about him, what he's done in his life, if he's hurt anyone else. I found him on Facebook and saw he got married, but much later in life than I would have expected. That automatic alarm bell, I felt, is something I will never forget. It wasn't like I was afraid or had any specific reason to doubt him until that moment. It was as if a sixth sense just rang the alarm. If you've ever experienced that gut feeling, you know exactly what I'm talking about. When I was about 15, I was babysitting my 4 younger cousins. The oldest was around 8, and I was watching TV in the living room when a knock came at the door. It was late, so it struck me as unusual. I approached the door cautiously and called out, "Hello?" A male voice answered, asking if someone by a random name was there. I told him no. Then he asked if I could open the door to give him a light for a cigarette. I said no again and stepped away from the door. But as I walked back into the living room, I noticed 2 faces peering in from the sides of the curtains, trying to look inside. They started knocking again, more urgently this time. I didn't hesitate. I walked into the kitchen to arm myself, my heart pounding in my chest. As I entered the kitchen, I froze. There was already someone halfway inside the house, with another man behind him. Instinct took over, and I grabbed a large knife from the counter, charging toward them. They panicked, stumbling as they ran off, disappearing into the night. Shaking and terrified, I quickly grabbed my cell phone. The knocking at the door continued. Now they were demanding to be let in. I called the police, explaining that I had 4 children in the house and that there were 4 people trying to break in. They told me to stay calm and get to a safe place with the kids, suggesting I lock myself in the bathroom until help arrived. I locked the back entrance and went back to the front. As I peered out the window, I saw them standing ominously at the bottom of the garden, watching the house while I stayed on the phone with the police. Soon, I heard sirens and the police arrived with helicopters and dogs. Despite their efforts, the men were never caught. To this day, I can't forget how close it came. I was just a teenager, but I did what I had to do to protect those kids. I'm just thankful I was able to keep them safe until the police showed up. When I was 4 years old, I was with my parents at a crowded market. It was a busy day, and suddenly, in the chaos of the crowd, I got separated from them. I remember feeling disoriented, completely overwhelmed by how big and noisy everything was. I started walking around in circles, crying, calling out for my mom and dad. That's when a tall man approached me. He told me not to worry and that he would help me find my parents. He suggested I come with him to his van, which was parked a street away, and that he could drive me around to help look for them. Something about him didn't sit right with me. I didn't understand why a stranger would want to help like that, and I knew it didn't feel safe. I told him that I should stay where I was. That's when he started getting more pushy, trying harder to convince me to go with him. His tone turned sharp, but even though I was young, I felt a deep, instinctual fear that I couldn't explain. Just as he reached for my hand, my parents suddenly appeared, frantic and relieved to find me. They hadn't even noticed the man standing there, but as soon as he saw them, he quickly melted into the crowd and vanished. I'll never know what his intentions were, but I can't help but think about how close I was to walking into something dangerous. If I had been just a little more trusting or gullible, who knows what could have happened. I'm grateful that my instinct kicked in and that my parents found me when they did. When I was 17, I thought I was invincible. One day, after school, I got tired of waiting for the bus and decided to hitchhike home. A scruffy-looking guy in an old, beat-up pickup truck pulled over, and I hopped in. He wouldn't look me in the eye, but kept flashing a creepy smile that made me uneasy. I told him I only needed to go about 12 blocks down the road, but after 6 blocks, he suddenly turned into a turn lane and signaled like he was about to make a turn. That's when something in my gut clicked, and I started to feel a rising sense of danger. As my radar went off, I spotted a random guy on the street waiting at the crosswalk. I started waving at him frantically, hoping to get his attention. Then I blurted out, "Oh man, I'm in trouble now. That's my brother, and he's gonna ask me who I was with in the truck." The random guy looked back at us, probably confused and trying to figure out what was going on. The creepy guy's smile immediately disappeared, and he abruptly turned off the turn signal, resuming the straight path down the road. I had him drop me off 3 blocks away from my house. I'm not sure why I thought to wave at that guy, but in hindsight, I really believe it saved me from something much worse. It felt like I dodged a bullet. I was sitting alone on the beach, enjoying the quiet, when I noticed a man walking along the water, staring at me. At first, I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he had friends or family behind me and wasn't actually looking at me. But then he started walking up from the water and came straight toward me. He didn't stop, just circled around me like he was sizing me up. I felt uncomfortable, but didn't make eye contact. After a moment, he walked away, and I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. About an hour later, he came back. Again, he went down to the water, glanced at me, and then started walking toward me. This time, as he got closer, I noticed he wasn't just staring at me. He was eyeing all of my things like he was taking inventory of what I had with me. That's when I finally spoke up. "Can I help you?" I asked. He seemed startled and quickly said, "Oh no," before walking off. But something wasn't right. My gut was screaming at me, and I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. They say to trust your instincts when something feels wrong, and in that moment, I just knew. I was too shaken to walk back to my car alone, so I approached another man nearby, someone who had been keeping to himself. I told him what had happened and asked if he could walk back with me to the parking lot, so I wouldn't be alone. He confirmed that he had noticed the man watching me the entire time. In fact, he said he'd seen him lurking around a couple of other girls too. That beach has never felt the same to me since. As I walked back with the kind stranger, I still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and the paranoia stayed with me all the way home. I'm so grateful for that man who helped me. Please, if you ever feel unsafe, trust your instincts and ask for help. Don't ignore that gut feeling. It might just save you from something worse. When I was 7 years old, I used to skip the school bus and walk home during exams because I loved walking. One day, I was about 1 kilometer from my house, walking along the main road, which wasn't very busy. Suddenly, a van with 4 or 5 guys pulled up, stopping about 4 to 5 meters away from me. They called out, asking me to come over and help them with directions. Something immediately felt wrong. I didn't say anything and just started walking away, keeping my distance. They sat there for a few moments before driving off. Looking back, I can't help but wonder why a van full of adult men would ask a young child for directions when there were shops nearby and plenty of adults around. At the time, there had been a lot of kidnappings in the area, and that thought still sent a chill down my spine. I'm just grateful I trusted my instincts and kept walking. When I was a teenager, I worked for my grandfather's construction company, doing all sorts of tasks, from helping roofers to working on equipment, and even landscaping at his house. One day, he bought a bunch of motorcycles and scooters with the idea of cleaning them up and selling them for a profit. He gave me the task of filling and swapping out the batteries, so I got to work. I filled the first battery with the acid solution as usual, but something made me pause. I had a sudden feeling I should put on some goggles or a face shield. I glanced around and found a face shield, so I decided to put it on for extra protection. I went back to filling the batteries, and just as I was finishing, the bottom of the acid container blew out, spraying acid all over my face. If I hadn't put that face shield on, I shudder to think of the burns and potential blindness I could have suffered. It was a close call, and I'm so thankful I trusted my instincts. Just a few days ago, I suddenly started feeling dizzy and seeing stars. I somehow managed to stumble downstairs to get my mom. She said I looked pale, and even though my speech wasn't slurred, she said it sounded all garbled. I was sweating like crazy, and the whole thing peaked when I briefly lost my vision. Has anyone ever experienced something like this? It's happened a couple of times before, and I still have no idea what it could be. I woke up to my alarm ringing and, as usual, forced myself to get out of bed by heading downstairs. When I got to the kitchen, I noticed the dish rack was in a weird spot, and I thought maybe my dad had moved it. I shrugged it off and went back upstairs to get ready for school. As my dad came down, he saw that the garage door was open, and then he realized our car, TV, and other things were gone while we had been sleeping. It turns out they had moved the dish rack to get to the window we always leave open for the cats. I was freaked out and had nightmares about someone breaking into our house for weeks after that. One night, my mom suddenly woke up from a deep sleep, overcome with an awful feeling. She immediately checked on my siblings and me, making sure we were all safe and asleep since it was around 2 a.m. Feeling silly for worrying over nothing, she decided to calm her nerves with a cigarette before heading back to bed. As she was trying to light it, something caught her eye. She looked over and realized that before my dad went to the bar, he'd made himself some ramen on the gas stove, but had turned the flame off and forgotten to shut the gas. Horrified, she quickly turned it off and rushed to open the doors and windows, not daring to smoke inside for 2 days because she was so paranoid. When I was in college, I worked the night shift. I got home to my studio apartment around 3 a.m. and went straight to take a shower. Afterward, I realized I had forgotten to lock my front door, so I quickly locked it and sat down at my desk, still wrapped in a towel. Not even 5 minutes later, I heard the door handle turning. Panic hit me immediately. My door was only about 4 feet away from where I was sitting. I froze in place, holding my breath until the knob finally stopped turning. I slowly got up and peered through the peephole. I could see at least 3 men walking around, trying to open doors. Their faces were not covered. I quickly called the police and gave them a description of the man. The next day, the apartment complex sent out a notice about several recent burglaries. I'm a petite woman, and I still shudder to think about what might have happened if my door had been left unlocked. Have you ever looked at someone and just known deep down that they were bad news? I was 17 at the time, working in a haunted house, playing the role of a delusional asylum patient. I was sitting on the floor, head in my knees, fake crying, just doing my usual act when I felt someone enter the room. Something in me told me not to look up, but against my better judgment, I did, not wanting to get in trouble. There was a man standing right over me, smiling. The way he looked, his expression, reminded me of Stanley Tucci's character in The Lovely Bones. He immediately made my skin crawl. Every instinct screamed that I was in danger. I got up, staying in character as best I could, even though I know I looked absolutely terrified. I hurried into the next room, which was part of the area I had to cover. This room was pitch dark, no lights, no camera, and no one else was around to see or help me. The only exits were the doorways I came in from and an emergency exit. located in the darkest corner of the room, of course. At first, I thought about hiding, but I knew it wouldn't work. I surveyed my surroundings, found the one place with a bit of light, and ran toward it, the back wall, which connected to the next section of the haunt. In that section was my co-worker, Gina. I was so scared I nearly broke character, but I forced myself to speak, trying to let Gina know something wasn't right. The man was getting closer. He was 3 feet away, hands reaching toward me. I quickly weighed my chances of reaching the emergency exit before he could grab me. Just then, Gina yelled at him, ordering him to stay away from me, and he looked at her, then back at me, still smiling, before lowering his hands. I nearly broke down in relief, but held it together long enough to rush to the makeup artists and ask them to call my boss and possibly security. I wanted them to find him and get him off the fairgrounds. My boss eventually tracked him down and followed him around for the rest of the night. At the end of the evening, he told me I had wasted his time. The man hadn't tried anything with anyone else, so it was nothing. But what he didn't understand was how powerful this man's presence alone had been. I've been cornered by men before, even punched in the face, but nothing had ever made me feel so powerless, so vulnerable like I did in that moment. Looking up at that man was the right thing to do. I know that now, but my body had reacted in a way that made it feel like the absolute worst decision I could have made. Twice, something literally vanished right before my eyes, and to this day, I have no idea how it happened. There was no logical explanation for it. Both times, it happened in the same alley. The first time I dropped a coin, and the second time it was a glove. I watched them both fall to the ground with my own eyes, but when I bent down to pick them up, they were just gone. I was staring at the spot where they had fallen, and they weren't there anymore. That's not normal. While I was 14, there was a man in my neighborhood I called the drunkard. Every weekend and holiday night, he'd be outside, cursing loudly and waking me up. At first, I thought he was just an annoying but harmless presence. But one night, it was pitch black, and I heard him at 1 a.m. shouting obscenities. Then, I heard a woman's voice pleading, "Please, just leave us alone." After a few moments, he finally left. But around 4 a.m., he came back, even more aggressive. He was slamming the screen door violently, banging on the wooden door, and making the woman cry in fear. The sound of that door being torn open and slammed shut, the hinges screeching under the pressure, was nightmarish. It was like something out of a horror movie. I had finally had enough. Despite my intense fear of talking on the phone and never having called emergency services before, I gathered enough courage to dial. Soon after, flashing lights passed my window and the commotion stopped. I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if no one had called the cops. What were the neighbors doing? I never found out which house the woman lived in, and I never heard from the drunkard again. Strangely, there was nothing in the news about anything happening on my street that day. A few weeks ago, my baby woke up in the middle of the night. I went in to settle him, but instead of going back to bed like usual, I sat outside his room, just waiting for him to calm down. I noticed the movement icon on the monitor was flashing, which made me think he was still restless. Here's the thing. The icon also flashes if the crib is empty of any breathing creature. Curious, I poked my head into his room, thinking, why is he moving so much? But it was completely silent. That's when a voice in my head whispered, something's not right. I quickly went over to check on him, and when I touched his back, I realized he wasn't breathing. Panic hit me hard, but somehow I managed to revive him. Honestly, I think the fear gave me a mini stroke. It was the most terrified I've ever been. If I had gone back to bed that night, I don't know if my baby would have woken up the next morning. I'm so grateful for those mom instincts that kicked in. Now, I trust them with everything I've got. I don't care if people think I'm paranoid. My gut saved my baby. While I was 18, I found out I was pregnant with my first child. I was incredibly sick and felt like something just wasn't right. I did everything I could, took my prenatals, ate what little I could manage through the nausea, and stayed away from alcohol and drugs. At 4 months, I started hemorrhaging heavily, so I went to the hospital. They found a heartbeat, but I was told I was pregnant with twins. One twin had no heartbeat, and the other wasn't doing well. A couple of hours later, the diagnosis changed to, there's just one baby, and he's not doing well. My son was diagnosed with gastroschisis, a condition where some of the baby's organs develop outside of their body. The lack of organs caused his spine to lack support, and his body was twisted in such a way that it looked like two babies. It was scary, but gastroschisis is survivable if treated. At 32 weeks, I hemorrhaged heavily again and started losing fluid, indicating ruptured membranes. By then, I learned that, on top of the organs being outside his body, my baby had not developed a sternum, the bone that protects the heart and determines how large it can grow. The surgeon I spoke to at the time said he could fix it, but a perinatologist explained that survival wasn't possible with both gastroschisis and the pentalogy of Cantrell, which included the lack of sternum. I spent the next 8 weeks on bed rest in the hospital, and with each fluid check, it became more apparent that his lungs weren't developing properly. At 40 weeks, I went into labor and chose to have a cesarean, hoping with everything I had that the surgeon's optimism was right, that my baby was reparable. But when the surgeon went on vacation, there was no backup. They left me in labor for 17 hours, which wasn't good for a baby with organs on the outside of his body and a weak heart. My son was born at 10:14 p.m., and he lived for almost 2 hours before passing away. I held him the whole time, and even though I did everything I could, it doesn't take away the pain of losing him. This story isn't mine, but my father-in-law's. One morning, he woke up with an overwhelming sense of dread. He told my mother-in-law that he'd had a terrible dream and felt something was deeply wrong, urging her to find their children. My mother-in-law contacted my wife and one of her brothers, but they couldn't reach their eldest brother. Tragically, it was later discovered that he had been murdered and dismembered the night before. His death was the result of involvement with drugs and gangs. He had been tortured before he was killed. The perpetrators were eventually apprehended and are serving life sentences, bringing some justice, but never enough to truly compensate for such a loss. I had just gotten home from Jack in the Box, where I ordered 10 tacos. It was around 2 a.m., and I had set up my phone to watch the Goldbergs while I ate. I was in a very rural area, so everything was quiet. As I turned towards the passenger door to grab a taco from the bag, I didn't think much of it. But when I turned back, I saw a horse's head in my car with me. I froze for a moment, completely startled. Turns out, the horse wasn't there to scare me. It just wanted a taco. The neighbor's horses had gotten loose and wandered onto my property. Apparently, they had a taste for fast food too. When I was in 5th grade, I had broken my leg and couldn't go outside to join the other kids, including my little sister. I was sitting inside, trying to spot her, when I saw a strange man walking up to the playground. I wondered who he could be, maybe a parent or a teacher from one of the other schools that share the same playground. He walked behind one of the adult supervisors, and suddenly, the supervisor collapsed. The other adults rushed to take the kids inside and tried to revive the supervisor, thinking he'd had a heart attack. Later that day, I was watching the news and learned what had happened. The man had stabbed the supervisor in the back, claiming that voices in his head told him to do it. Those were the words from the news anchor. It didn't fully hit me until years later that I had actually witnessed a murder. Every morning, I took the train, RER, and then the bus to work. Bus strikes were common, so when I got to the bus stop one day and saw a crowd of people, I asked around to see if there was a strike. I ended up chatting with a guy about the bus situation. We had the usual small talk, and when the bus finally arrived, I went on my way to work. On my way home that afternoon, I got back on the train, and to my surprise, that same guy boarded the train heading back into the city. We exchanged the typical, "Fancy seeing you here, have a nice day," and I put my headphones in to avoid the usual light chit-chat or mild flirting that often comes from random encounters like this. As the train neared my stop, he asked me, "What's at this stop?" I live near St. Michel in Paris, which is close to famous landmarks like Notre Dame and Musée de Cluny. It was clear from his question that he wasn't familiar with the neighborhood, so I answered casually and prepared to get off. To my alarm, he also got off the train with me. My gut instinct went into overdrive. I knew he was following me. I immediately started to get paranoid. I lived right by the metro entrance, so I did some quick thinking, changing my appearance by using my umbrella to cover my face, circling around the neighborhood, trying to lose him. I've been catcalled and followed plenty of times, but this felt different. There was something about him that made my skin crawl. The next morning, I went down the metro stairs around 5 a.m., and as soon as I reached the bottom, I heard him call out, "Mademoiselle, Mademoiselle." It was him again. From that moment on, I made sure to take a different route to and from work each day. I even asked my coworkers to drive me to different RER stops instead of relying on the bus. It felt like the only way to be safe. When I was a resident assistant RA at a community college, I was asked to do a well check on one of my students. I knocked, called out, and then, following protocol, called my boss before using the master key to let myself in. I entered the student's room and immediately saw her slumped over, half off her bed, her head resting in a paper grocery bag. There was pizza and other food scattered on her bed, along with marijuana pipes and alcohol on her desk. I shook her arm to check for a response, but it felt wrong. Her skin was cold, and it didn't feel like living tissue. That's when I realized something was horribly wrong. I worked graveyard shifts at a high-care home located next to a long-term men's shelter. Most of the time, we get along well with the residents. Occasionally, some of the men become rowdy at night and come over to our home, knocking on doors. We usually manage to redirect them without any issues. For safety, we've installed sensor lights at every doorway of the home. Often, it's the same resident who forgets where he lives. One night, I arrived at work to find a sensor light flickering over the footpath and garden. Initially, I didn't think much of it and started preparing to get out of my locked car. But then, an overwhelming feeling of dread washed over me, and I stayed put. Suddenly, the light bulb blew, plunging the area into complete darkness. I started my car and turned on my high beams just in time to see a man hiding in the garden, the same path I would have taken to enter the house. I also saw something heavy in his hand as he tried to flee. I immediately called my co-worker, a young blonde woman inside the house, and told her which way the man was heading. I instructed her to check all the doors and not to open them until the police gave the all clear. It turned out the man was known to the police for sex offenses. He had also been watching our home for a while, as evidenced by fingerprints on the outside of the windows and footprints in the garden beds. What keeps me awake at night is what the police told me. His preferred victims were 5 feet 5 inches brunettes in their mid to late 20s. I'm the only one on our team who fits that description. Back in high school, a buddy of mine came over during the winter, and we decided to hang out with my brother around the neighborhood. We were messing around, sledding, throwing snowballs, and just enjoying the snow. One of the things we did was walk across the frozen neighborhood lakes. We reached one lake, and I suddenly had this gut-wrenching feeling that something was wrong. I told them we shouldn't go out onto the ice, but they just laughed and started calling me names, mocking me as they continued onto the lake. I stood on the shore, feeling uneasy. As they made their way toward the middle, I heard a loud crack and thud. In the next moment, my friend fell all the way through the ice, and my brother fell in up to his waist. Thankfully, they managed to grab onto the edge of the ice and pull themselves out before it broke completely. We ran back to my house to get them out of their wet clothes. Looking back, I'm so glad I trusted that instinct. It was late at night, just about 10 minutes after I had gotten home from work, when I heard a knock on the door. I opened it to find 2 cops standing there, looking completely legit, uniforms, hats, and a police car with lights flashing on the dashboard. They claimed they were chasing someone and needed access to my backyard. I told them there was no way the person they were chasing could be in my yard. I had a dingo, and the yard was surrounded by 4-meter-high fences with a locked gate. Anyone trying to get in would have to scale the fence, and we'd definitely hear it with the dog around. Then they switched tactics, saying they needed to come inside and check the house, just in case the person had broken in. Something fell off, and I immediately said no. My instincts were screaming at me that something wasn't right. They didn't back off. Instead, they insisted and tried to barge their way in, but luckily, the screen door was locked. They started threatening me, saying they'd come back with a warrant and arrest me for obstruction. I slammed the front door shut and quickly called the police station. The desk cop on the phone was incredibly helpful and concerned. After hearing my story, he told me they didn't have any officers in the area and immediately sent a car to check things out. He stayed on the phone with me until the real cops arrived to verify who they were. It turned out that the cops were fakes. The real officers picked them up a few blocks away. Apparently, they had seen me stop for gas at the servo and followed me home, likely because they noticed I was alone. It was terrifying to think how easily things could have gone differently if I hadn't trusted my gut. I tried reaching out to my friend, but she wasn't responding. I texted her, then called, but still nothing. I even tried calling her workplace. No answer there either. Desperate, I called her other job and found out she had been arrested by immigration authorities. After hearing the news, the manager from her second workplace and I teamed up to get her a lawyer and help get her out. It was a long, stressful process, but we managed to get her out of jail. Unfortunately, she was eventually deported, but at least we were able to get her out of that awful situation. My wife and I moved into our new house last year, just weeks before the lockdowns began. We managed to get all our things unloaded from the moving truck and into the house by 8 p.m. After a long day, we decided to crash on the couch for the night. But no more than 5 minutes after lying down, someone started ringing the doorbell nonstop and pounding on the door like crazy. We had just moved in, so we didn't know anyone around here. I was a little freaked out by how urgent the knocking sounded, so I got up to check. When I opened the door, there was nobody there, just complete darkness. I peered down the street to see if maybe some kids were messing around, but there was no sign of anyone. To this day, we've never figured out who it was or what they wanted. When I was in college, someone tried to break into my apartment at 2:30 a.m. I was lying in bed, naked and reading Harry Potter with my bedroom window wide open since it was on the ground floor. I heard footsteps in the alley behind my apartment, and then the unmistakable sound of my window screen sliding up. Someone was pushing on the glass. My heart started racing as I slowly stood up, walked across the room, and turned off the light. That's when I saw the silhouette of a tall man standing at my window, his figure outlined by the streetlights in the alley. Panicked, I screamed that I had a gun. He immediately ran off. I called the police, but they searched the area and didn't find anyone. 2 days later, at exactly 2:30 a.m., I was jolted awake by the same sound, someone trying to open my window. This time, I kept my light off, and when I looked up, there he was again, the same silhouette at my window. I called the police again, and they arrived quickly, searching the alley without success. The very next day, as I was heading out to class, I bumped into my creepy neighbor, Kevin. He was a middle-aged guy living in a college student neighborhood, and this was the first time he'd ever spoken to me. He stepped out onto his porch and said, "Hey, do you want to come up for some coffee?" I looked at him, realizing he looked exactly like the tall figure I'd seen at my window. I politely said, "No thanks, I'm late for class." He pressed on, "Are you sure? It'll only take a minute. Let me be clear, attention to any potential predators. It does not just take a minute to share a cup of coffee with a neighbor." What Kevin had in mind was far more sinister, and he clearly didn't realize how revealing that comment was. I'm glad I walked away that day, but it was a moment that made me rethink everything about that man. A week before Halloween this year, I woke up and was completely disoriented. I couldn't understand why I was at home, and I had no idea how to log into work. It was like my brain wasn't connecting the dots. I told my sister-in-law, who was staying with me, that I was going to the corner store to grab some cigarettes, and then I just walked out, disappearing for a few hours. Eventually, my family realized something was seriously wrong, and they figured out that I was in the middle of a mental breakdown. When I was 18, I flew to Seattle and made my way down to Phoenix. This was back in 2011, so I should have known better, but I was young and naive, not thinking things through. I ended up in some small town that I can't even remember the name of now. An older couple gave me a ride in their RV, but they stopped in this town for reasons I can't recall. I found myself wandering the main street, trying to figure out what to do next. I didn't have much money left, and I wasn't sure exactly where I was, but I knew I had to head west along the highway to reach Phoenix. That's when a guy in a red pickup truck pulled up and asked if I needed a ride. By then, I'd already hitched a few rides with strangers, and I almost went with him. But then I stopped myself. I had a rule by that point. I'd only go with couples. I figured they'd be safer, more trustworthy than a random person on their own. I told the guy I was planning to stick around and I appreciated the offer. He seemed confused and asked, "But you're going to Phoenix?" That's when it hit me. He had overheard me talking to the older couple about my plans, and now I had a bad feeling. Something wasn't right. I quickly made an excuse, saying I needed to go back to the area where the couple was, telling him I'd forgotten my phone charger. He offered to give me a ride back, but I declined. It was only a couple of blocks, but he got visibly frustrated with me. That's when I bolted. I ran as fast as I could to a little country diner and locked myself in the bathroom, my heart pounding. I stayed there for what felt like hours. Eventually, I managed to calm down and call my mom later that night. I cried and apologized to her, telling her I was sorry for being such a reckless kid. I promised her that once I made it to Mesa, Arizona, I'd get a flight back home. I woke up an hour and a half before my alarm and couldn't fall back asleep, so I decided to get up and make my partner's lunch. As I got out of bed, I noticed the front door was open and the living room light was on. My mom had been staying with me and had brought her dog, so I assumed she had taken him outside. But something felt off. The air around me felt strangely tense. I started making lunch, but realized my mom still hadn't come back inside. Concerned, I opened the door to check on her, and that's when I saw her at the bottom of the porch steps, lying in a pool of blood. For a split second, I thought she'd been shot. It turns out she had tripped on the stairs and cracked her head open. She ended up spending a week in the hospital with a brain injury, but she's okay now. In a strange twist of fate, the doctors found a spot in her leg where her cancer had spread, something they probably wouldn't have caught if she hadn't fallen. So, while it was a terrifying moment, it ended up saving her life in a way. As I was coming in for landing, I lowered the throttle on my plane, and suddenly the engine began to sputter. It hit me that if I took the power off completely, the engine would likely die. I quickly assessed my altitude and determined I still had enough height to make it to the runway. With that, I pulled back on the power, and sure enough, the engine cut out. Now in a glide, I focused on getting back to the runway. I had one shot, one opportunity to make this work. I side-slipped the plane to ensure I didn't overshoot, and by some miracle, I lined up perfectly and touched down on the pavement. Afterward, I found out that the spark plugs had gotten gummed up, which caused the engine trouble. I was about 14 when my sister and I went to the movies. We were watching the trailers when a group of loud guys came in. Of all the empty seats in the theater, they chose to sit directly behind us. Immediately, I felt uneasy. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Then it happened. One of them reached around me, his hand touching my bare skin. I froze, paralyzed with fear. He said, "I really like your necklace. What's your name?" I could feel them closing in, their presence suffocating. Their breath was on me. They were too close. My sister, also terrified, found the courage to shout, "Leave her alone." Thankfully, an older man in the audience turned around, saw what was happening, and told them to get out. To our immense relief, they did. But even now, the memory of that moment still deeply disturbs me. It was a late night at the train station, and I was waiting for a friend who was running behind. While I was standing there, I noticed a man just staring at me. His gaze never faltered. I tried moving around the station, hoping he'd lose interest, but no matter where I went, he followed me. As a young woman, I felt too uneasy to confront him directly. In a panic, I picked up my pace and started heading towards a more crowded area, hoping for safety in numbers. Once I reached the crowd, I didn't hesitate. I ran. He chased for a bit, but eventually I managed to lose him. One day, a guy pulled over and offered me a ride. I got in because he reminded me of someone I knew, though I couldn't quite place who. It was a small town, so you'd often run into people who felt familiar, even if you didn't know them that well. Turns out, he wasn't who I thought he was, and I wasn't who he thought I was either. He'd mistaken me for his nephew since we were both tall, skinny, and had curly blonde hair. I actually knew the kid he thought I was, which made it even more bizarre. Looking back, it's kind of funny, but I was only 14 at the time. Even though everything ended up fine, I knew the second I realized he was a complete stranger that I'd made a serious mistake. I'm a chalk muralist, and I was hired by my city to create artwork along the downtown walkways for a festival. The tricky part with chalk art is that it has to be made the same day it's displayed. That meant I had to start around 4 a.m. to finish in time for the festival, which kicked off at 10 a.m. It was around 5 a.m., still dark, and I was wrapping up my work outside a coffee shop in a standalone building. I noticed a guy walking down the street several blocks away, pretty far in front of me. He was far enough that, even if he sprinted toward me, I'd have plenty of time to jump in my car and drive off. But something felt off, so I kept an eye on him. When he got about a block away, he turned down a street where I couldn't see him anymore. That's when my gut told me to get out of there. Without even packing up my chalk or supplies, I grabbed my car keys and made a beeline for my car on the other side of the lot. I got in and locked the doors just in time to see him sprinting out from the opposite side of the coffee shop, exactly where I would have been on the ground, in a vulnerable position if I hadn't moved. The way he was moving, definitely in attack mode. I ended up sitting in my car for about half an hour, waiting for the sun to come up. Once it was light enough, I grabbed my supplies and went back to finish my work. It set me back a bit, but honestly, I'd take that delay any day if it meant staying safe. Last year, I went to visit my sister with my mom, and on the way back, she asked if I could visit my dad since we were driving by my hometown. It wasn't something she'd ever asked before, and they've been divorced for 20 years. At that point, I hadn't seen my dad in at least 4 years, but I agreed. We stopped at his house and knocked, but no one answered. So, we decided to head home. As we were driving, we passed a pub, and my mom joked that he was probably there, given that he had struggled with alcoholism. 2 weeks later, we got a call from my dad's girlfriend's daughter, telling us that he was in the hospital. It turned out that he had suffered a stroke that same day we had driven by. He had the stroke in the morning, and we passed the pub in the afternoon. He passed away a month later. We're still angry, not just about losing him, but because they didn't inform us about what had happened until 2 weeks after he'd been sent to the hospital. My wife had just given birth to our son when, moments later, she said, "I feel like I still need to push," and she did. Out came blood, so much blood. The doctors quickly assessed the situation and said it seemed like a section of the placenta hadn't detached, and there was just free-flowing blood. I ended up sitting in the corner of the delivery room, holding my newborn son, while our daughter stayed with my parents because of COVID rules. Meanwhile, the pool of blood kept growing bigger, and the health professionals in the room went from a team of 3 to a team of 18. The craziest part? I knew most of them since I worked down the hall at that very hospital. The nurse called the code blue, which, as I knew all too well, was never a good sign. My friend, who was a doctor there, came in and said, "I need to give her some ketamine. Things will get weird. Do you understand?" At the time, I just thought, of course I understand ketamine. I'm an addictions counselor. It wasn't until later that I realized he was basically asking if I was sure I wanted to stay in the room for whatever might come next. The code blue call in our hospital is the scariest one. It typically means a child is at serious risk of passing. It was surreal watching how quickly everyone responded. Outside the room, I saw a flood of people rushing by the tiny door window. Through the connecting door to the other delivery room, which had been empty before, I saw a whole bunch of new faces. Our hospital pharmacist had the crash cart. My family doctor from the ER was there with another crash cart, and our secondary anesthesiologist showed up. The only time I've ever seen more doctors in one room was when I was presenting to them about naloxone. Thankfully, the code blue never escalated. The doctor who had delivered my son was able to detach the placenta and stop the bleeding. Later, we were told she'd lost 2 to 2.5 liters of blood, apparently. That's a lot. The code blue had been called so they could rush in blood from the city, since we didn't have enough stored at our hospital. They won't bring it unless the official code is called. Looking back, it felt like even more blood, honestly. Once the immediate danger was over, environmental services was in the room cleaning up, and I hadn't moved an inch. My wife was wheeled away to the emergency room for further monitoring, and eventually, we were sent to the end of the hall to spend some quiet time with our son. The doctor initially wanted my wife to stay in the hospital for a minimum of 7 days, but after 2.5 days, we convinced her to let us go home. The mental toll of being in the hospital with everything that had happened was just too much. Plus, we lived only 5 minutes away, and I had made that drive in under 3 minutes when my daughter had stopped breathing at 5 days old. I knew if anything went wrong with my wife, I could get to the ER just as fast as if we were still in the hospital. Now, almost 2 years later, or actually about 18 months, I look back on it, and even with all I've experienced in my life, clients overdosing in my office, a friend getting hit by a tree and needing a helicopter rescue from the forest fires, explosions, car crashes, this is the one event that can still stop me in my tracks. This is the first time I've written it all out. And as I write, I realize I'm not as healthy about it as I thought I was. One night, around 10 or 11 p.m., I was sitting on my stoop having a smoke. Across the street, I noticed 2 guys walking toward me. They casually started asking if I knew someone, a woman who supposedly lived on the block. I told them I hadn't heard of her and didn't know who they were talking about. They kept walking and eventually reached the bottom of my stoop, still engaging me in conversation. Before I knew it, they suddenly jumped up the stairs, pulled a gun on me, and mugged me. Looking back, it's clear they were distracting me to get closer. Now, I'm a lot more cautious when strangers start approaching and asking random questions. I'm slightly allergic to bees and wasps. When I get stung, I swell up pretty badly for a few days, and it's definitely uncomfortable. One summer when I was a teen, I had just finished swimming laps for about an hour and was sunbathing by the neighborhood pool. I felt something land on my foot, and without thinking, I kicked at it. Unfortunately, it was a wasp, and it stung me right on my toe. The pain was sharp, but what followed was worse. I started to feel lightheaded and dizzy. The pool was just a 2-minute walk from my house, and it was the middle of the day, so the place was empty. I was alone, no cell phone, and no one was home anyway. I tried to walk home, but every few feet I had to sit down. It felt like I was about to pass out. Somehow, I finally made it home, but I collapsed right by the front door, unable to move for about 30 minutes. Eventually, I gathered the strength to get up, drank some water, and had a snack. After that, I felt completely fine. At the time, I didn't think much of it. But looking back, it definitely seems like an allergic reaction now. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and we will see you in the next video.